story of the Bible is the pursuit of God, the desire of God to share his love with his people and with everyone. We know that the love of God drew even the Son of God to die on the cross. Behind that lies a love from God that is uncompromising. It is what led Christ to die on the cross for each of us. We don't often talk about that uncompromising nature of the love of God. The passage we have from Mark the Gospel of Mark was one of the earliest books written in the New Testament, certainly the earliest gospel written, around about AD 60. And in about AD 60, the early church, the Christians, were facing the first sort of systemic persecution that they had experienced. There's been a bit of localized outbreaks here and there, but when Mark is writing down his gospel, the good news of Christ, their Christian church is being scattered by systematic societal persecution by the Roman Empire. Christians face death for following Jesus, as they still do in various places around the world. And so it's probably not a surprise to find that discipleship and the cost of following Jesus is one of the main themes that comes through Mark's gospel. But the words from Jesus that we heard today are hard. They're hard to hear. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. If your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. If your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than to have two eyes. This is Jesus not messing around at all, is it? This is Jesus laying out very starkly, in language that is hard to hear, the uncompromising nature of God's love for us and the cost of following Christ. The things that Jesus talks about there in the days when Jesus was on earth would have caused people to be socially excluded. They would have caused them not to be able to find employment. They would have caused them to be ridiculed. Thankfully, we've moved past those days now. But what Jesus is talking about is decisions that are made by disciples of Christ, which can have, to some perceptions, negative impacts on our life as it is now. And Jesus talks about, our translation uses this word hell. Now, whatever you think about hell, it's actually quite an unhelpful translation here, because the actual word that Jesus uses is Gehenna. Now, Gehenna was the municipal rubbish tip outside of Jerusalem in the valley of Hinnom. It was where carts would go day and night, taking the rubbish from people in this bustling, vibrant city, throwing it on this big heap. It was so full of stuff that it burned constantly, day and night. The problem with translating Gehenna as hell is we're very good at pushing thoughts about hell and eternity and things off into the distance, whatever we think about it. What Jesus is talking about is what would have been part of the lived experience of those who were listening to him. You couldn't live in Jerusalem without seeing occasionally the fires and the smoke coming up from this rubbish tip. You couldn't have lived in Jerusalem without, when the wind was blowing in the wrong direction, being exposed to the waft of the smell from this huge rubbish dump across the city. It was part of the lived experience of the people that Jesus was talking to. We probably don't have anything that's equivalent today. We're very good, aren't we, at least in developed countries, of taking our rubbish and hiding it far away where no one can see. We conveniently forget that quite a lot of our rubbish is shipped around the world to developing countries, and that actually, by disposing of it that way, we are forcing poorer people across the world to live and to make a living from the rubbish that we so casually throw in the bin. Possibly the closest we can get to it is when we walk behind a rubbish truck, and you get that waft coming from the back, and you give thanks when the truck moves on, or you can step to one side. I've been caught behind a few of those when I've been cycling before, and it doesn't leave for a pleasant few moments. Of course, that's a small sense of what Gehenna would have been like for the people in Jerusalem. But the key thing is, it was part of their lived experience. When Jesus is talking in this passage about the cost of discipleship, he's very much rooting that in the reality of how we live our lives. In the messiness of life, in the highs and the lows, the joys and the challenges, the tears and the laughter. It's in the midst of all those things that we live out our daily call to be disciples of Christ. It's wonderful that we are baptizing Jude and Frida's Day, and we're going to celebrate as they have the fullness of God come and live in them. But they, like all of us, will be starting a journey of living out that call to be a disciple of Christ in the midst of the messiness of life every day of our lives. Gehenna was a place where things were cast which were so damaged that there was no more use for them. As Luke says in his reading, that they were cast there when they were neither fit for the manure heap or for the dustbin. And indeed, in first century Judaism, sin, a difficult word sometimes for us to talk about today, sin was not this moral thing up in the sky. It was very much about damage. It was very much rooted in the damage that we so often do. Damage to ourselves, damage to our neighbors, damage to our relationship with God, damage to creation as well. I wonder whether today, if Jesus had been saying these words, he would have continued after saying the phrase about your eye causing you to stumble. I wonder if he would have said, isn't it better for you to be mildly inconvenienced on your journeys, or to change the way that you eat, shop, or live, rather than perish in the rising flood tides, drought, and forest fires of climate change? We do damage to the world around us, and the news this week has been filled with Insulate Britain and their protests. It seems to me a very British form of protest, this. There's a clear aim to insulate Britain. There's a clear way of paying for it, take the money from the roads and apply it to the houses and businesses that need it, and it's done by sitting down. It seems to me a very British form of protest. But there's no doubt those who are risking jail to protest climate change, whether it's Insulate Britain, Extinction Rebellion, or whatever it is, are not willing to compromise. They are uncompromising in their view that we have to take drastic action now, together, to fight climate change. It's not very far from the uncompromising nature Jesus calls us to have often as disciples of Christ. And it's always worth taking some time just to take stock, honestly, before God of where we are in our lives. If someone looked at our social media accounts or the relationships we have in our lives, if someone looked at the way we used our time or spent our money, if work colleagues or friends honestly critiqued the way we speak, the way we behave, would people know that we were followers of Christ? Would they know that we believed and loved a God who can transform and heal all things? There is a real time to take stock and be honest about those. And it seems to me that what Jesus says here, if there are areas of our lives, and I'm sure there are for all of us, which do not fully reflect the love of God, do they need to be drastically cut off? Do they need to be drastically changed? That is hard. But thankfully for all of us, in the midst of that, and the midst of the uncompromising call of God in our lives, there is grace. There is more grace of God than we can possibly imagine. Grace that reaches beyond our dreams and indeed our hopes. And we see that grace coming out in the words of Jesus about salt, which seem to sit really strangely at the end of this passage. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its saltiness, how can you season it? Now, the chemists amongst you will know that salt never actually loses its saltiness. to do so would for it to stop being salt. So what on earth is Jesus saying here? Well, most of the people who were listening to Jesus would never have had salt in its purest form. They can never go down to the local shop and get a whole thing of salt and come back and scatter it around, or get the rock salt or the sea salt or the infused salt or all sorts of things that we can buy so easily these days. What they would have had is a mixture of sand and of salt that had not been properly sifted. And their hope was that there was enough salt in that mixture so that it did the same job as pure salt, that it continued to preserve things, that it continued to help things to taste nice. That's fine. But the problem is, if you don't pay attention to your salty mixture, it gets damp. And as it gets damp over time, it's the salt that gradually leaches away and disappears, until before you know it, you are holding simply a handful of salt. And when you spread it over your food, a handful of sand, when you spread it over your food, you end up with a mouthful of sand. When you cover your meat with it to preserve it, you end up with rotten meat covered in sand. That mixture of sand and salt fails to do the job that salt does. And actually, right at the beginning of this passage from Mark, we see Jesus putting that idea about all of us having salt and sand in our lives into action. John says to Jesus, "We've seen someone casting out demons in your name. We tried to stop them because they're not following us." You know what, Jesus? They can't have all the good things about following you. They're casting out demons and healing people and things, unless they're going to really commit, unless they're going to be uncompromising, give up everything and follow you like we have. Well, Jesus says, hang on a minute. Yes, they may not be walking the path that we're walking to Jerusalem. Yes, they might not be quite at that place yet. But in the midst of the sand in their lives, there is salt. And there is enough salt that God is working through them. And who are we to deny that? In the midst of the uncompromising call of God in our lives, there is so much grace of God, as Jesus recognizes that all of us have a mixture of sand and salt in who we are. That all of us, as we seek to follow Christ more closely, don't live it out perfectly in the messiness of life. We are a mixture of salt and sand. This is the model Jesus gives us. The model of following Jesus is fully rooted in the lived reality of life for all of us. A life which isn't perfect. A life which has joys and has sadnesses. A life which has mountaintops and valleys, light and darkness. And yet, as we seek to live out the call of Christ on our lives, as we seek at moments by the power of God to be decisive and to take those things which mean we are not compromising on that call. And yet, there is grace to be found and known every day in the recognition that we all live a little bit as a mixture of salt and of sand. As Jude and Frida start their journey with God today, their discipleship journey over the years ahead will be lived out in the messiness of life. We will be declaring over them that whatever happens on that journey, God lives in them. God is present with them, and God's love is declared over them for all eternity. That is the great gift that holds us all as people who seek to follow Christ. Whether we place ourselves like one of the disciples, whether we place ourselves with the person who is not stopped from seeking to follow Christ in the way that they know best. That is the call and the hope for each of us, of God's presence in us and with us, of God's love declared over us for all eternity. I said I had 2 tomato plants. Well, I was very uncompromising with one of those, and as soon as the tomato blight hit, I did what I said should be done. I cut it all back, and it was difficult because I cut off what looked like they were going to be some great tomatoes, and I left the plant looking bare, looking quite pathetic, really. But now it is flourishing. Now it is green and lively and full of beautiful fruits in the tomatoes that are on it. The other plant I left. I left because I thought if I just left it a bit longer, there'd be some nice tomatoes, and a bit longer and I'll get a few more. And now it's useless. Now it's totally useless, covered in tomato blight with no good tomatoes and fruit on it. It's not even good for the compost heap. It just needs to be discarded and thrown away. We need to be bold enough at those moments in our life to follow the uncompromising love of God, but also we need to be kind enough to ourselves to recognize the grace of God present in us and with us as we seek to live out our lives as followers of Christ, as people who declare the saltiness of God, but live with the sandiness of human existence. May we be bold, may we be kind, and may we know that God, in the midst of the reality of life, declares God's love over us again and again, as God will declare God's love over Jude and Frida today and for all eternity. Amen.